at Temple Square in front of the Assembly Hall, and I'm here today to share with you something that I enjoyed when I was a child. You know, when I was growing up, we always heard the story about the crickets coming in and invading the valley, and we heard about the seagulls and how they came in and saved the day. Well, today we're going to find out a little about how that affects you and your family. So today we're going to put on our hats and we're going to go back in time and we're going to learn about the connection between the Carlile and this monument.
Our Carlile lineage starts in the 1600s with Timothy Carlile being born in Yorkshire. The next in line is William Carlile, born in Lincolnshire. Then we have John Carlile and his son, John Carlile and Robert Carlile, all being born in the 1700s in Lincolnshire. Now Robert named his third child John, but he only lived 2 years. So his next son, born a year after the death of the first John, was also named John. This John, born in Nottinghamshire, named his sixth son John. He is the first generation Utah born in Spanish Fork. As you can see, the family's name was John. So tying this together, John Carlile, who was born in Spanish Fork, is the father to Charles Francis Carlile. Now from Charles Francis, as far back as we can take the Carlile line, is only 8 generations. Lincolnshire is a county in which they call the East Midlands of England. It lies on the east with a long coastline on the North Sea. It is the second largest county in England. It's predominantly used for agricultural use. Lincolnshire not only has historical sites that are from the Iron Age, the Bronze Age, but even the prehistoric Stone Age where artifacts have been found here. Now, were our ancestors inhabitants of any of these ages? Have they been here since the Stone Age? Did they come and settle in with the Celtic people? It's not for us to know right now, but it's more likely that our lineage probably comes down from Scotland. This is the Carlile coat of arms that I used for many years in my teaching. It includes a gold background with a black chevron, 3 black birds, and 3 gold stars. Now again, there are many different coat of arms that would depict the Carlile clan. Now just as a side note, the Carlile name, we can see that Timothy and William spelled their last names with an S in it. And more current records of our ancestors crossing the ocean and the plains, their names were recorded with an S in Carlile. This is probably due to the fact that the people that were writing down the names on the ship ledger and the wagon train ledger sounded out and used the most common sound or spelling of the family name. And now we start the pioneer story, starting with Robert Carlile, who was born on April 23rd, 1789 in Colby, Lincolnshire, England. He was the 5th out of 9 children born to John and Anna Marie. May 14, 1817, Robert married Christiana Spoutzer. Robert was 28, Christiana was 20. Together they were blessed with 8 children, 5 of them living into adulthood. Now remember, Robert and Christiana had a son who only lived 2 years. His name was John, and the next son born to them, they also named John. In England, Robert owned no land of his own, but he hired out to work for those who did. He taught and encouraged his boys to be tillers of the soil. Because the family was large, money was hard to come by. Robert taught his children to look out for themselves and to do all they could to help the rest of the family. They were taught to be honest in all their dealings and to respect the rights of others. They were a happy family and worked hard and planned together. Now it was Christiana who, while visiting her sister suggested that they go hear a sermon by a preacher presenting a most peculiar denomination. Christiana consented, and the 2 girls went to hear the preacher, who was Orson Pratt. Now the English used to call these preachers who preached this unusual new religion dippers, because they were immersed in the water when baptized. When Orson Pratt spoke, the Spirit immediately bore witness to Christianity of the divinity of the Restoration movement. It is said that the gift of tongues fell on her, and she had to place her hand over her mouth to keep her from speaking out in the service. She returned twice to hear Pratt, and was fully converted to the Latter-day Saint faith. She was so enthusiastic about the message that she invited him to her area to preach. And at that time, her whole family, including her husband Robert, were converted. Robert said before he had heard Orson Pratt that he had led a wicked life. But in 1848, when Robert was 59 and Christiana was 51, they joined the church along with their entire family. Now, Robert claims as he was being baptized, he had a vision, just another confirmation for him of the truthfulness of the gospel. When baptized, he arose from the waters of baptism to walk a new life. This new life would bring so many changes and adventures to the Carlile family. A year after their baptism, the family decided that they wanted to go live with the saints in Zion. So on November 10, 1849, they set sail out of Liverpool on the ship Zetland with 258 saints for the 69-day voyage. They arrived in New Orleans on December 26, 1849. Luckily, they were in pretty good health and so grateful to be on land again. From there, they traveled up the Mississippi River to St. Louis, where they spent 2 months, and then moved on to Council Bluffs, Iowa, and there they remained until the spring of 1852. On June 15, 1852, they started their trek across the plains, leaving with the Henry Bryant Manning Jolley Company that included 256 pioneer members. Robert was 63 and Christiana was 55, and they traveled with their 2 youngest sons, James, age 23, and George, age 16. Now John, your direct line, and his brothers were also able to attend and travel with the family in this company. Robert had been able to get his own wagons, ox, and teams of cows so that he was independent and did not have to ask the church for help. The teams of cows were milked morning and night. The milk that was not used was put in buckets and hung from the bottom of the wagons on a pole ridge, and the swaying and movements of the wagon turned the milk into butter and buttermilk. The days were long and hard, and sometimes they only made 8 to 10 miles a day because someone was always breaking down, and the tools for repairing the wagons were crude. Some days it rained, and some days they traveled without water, but even that did not dampen their courage. At night they would gather their wagons in a circle, made a fire in the center, and after a meager meal, they sang songs, told stories, and sometimes even danced. If there was no signs of danger, they all went to bed on the hard ground, where they tried to get a good night's sleep to be ready for tomorrow. They finally arrived in Salt Lake City on September 9, 1852. By October 1852, the travel-weary saints landed in Provo more than 5 months after leaving Council Bluffs. After resting for a month, they then left Provo on November 25th and moved to Palmyra, which is now known as Spanish Fork. They built their homes here and thought that that's where they would stay. But after going through the Walker Indian War in 1853 and then dealing with the 1854 to 1856 grasshopper plague, which left their crops destroyed and them starving, they decided to move on. Unfortunately, before moving on, Robert was knocked down by a steer and broke his leg. This left him lame, and he had to use a cane for the rest of his life. Now, in the spring of 1860, Robert and his wife Christiana moved to Heber. And just as a side note, 3 of their sons, John, James, and George, had come up the Provo Canyon the year before to settle Heber. But now the family is together and is ready to settle the valley. Robert only lived a few months in their new homeland. On October 25th, 1861, after a short illness, Robert died. He was 72 years old, and Robert was the 5th person to be buried in the Heber Cemetery. Now, Christiana lived 30 years after her husband's death. She lived many years all by herself until she went blind. She always seemed very happy, always encouraged those who came to see her, and never complained about being blind. On Thanksgiving Day, November 1891, she requested that all of her near relatives come to the house for dinner and insisted that they set the table up in the room where she laid in bed. She said, quote, "I want to know that you're all getting a good dinner," unquote. They had a very lovely visit, and a few days later, on November 30th, 1891, she passed away. At the time of her passing, she was the oldest person living in the Wasatch County. She was 95. So now let's continue our direct line through introducing to you John Carlile, who was born on May 25, 1825 in Nottinghamshire. John was the sixth child out of 7 born to Robert and Christiana. He would be the only son living to adulthood. And like his father, John was a farmer and hired out to work for others on their land. John was a lover of horses and took great care of them, so he always had work. John married Elizabeth Williamson on January 21, 1844. Now Elizabeth was 4 years older than John. They had 7 children, but only 5 living to adulthood. John was baptized along with the rest of his family on November 11, 1848 at the age of 23. However, it took Elizabeth a little bit longer. It took her 3 years until she was baptized in 1851 at the age of 30. A year after baptism, John and Elizabeth left with his father and his brothers from England to the United States on the ship Zetland. For unknown reasons, they left behind their 5-year-old daughter, Sarah Ann. After the voyage, they crossed the plains, then landed in Provo, and then on to Palmyra. The bonus, the family was together. John was 24. The family tried to settle in Palmyra, but the conditions were brutal. With the Walker Indian War raging and the Indians burning down the small settlements in 1853 and the 3-year grasshopper plague, life was hard. Grasshoppers destroyed their crops. Food was very scarce, so they had to live off roots and what little grain they could glean from the field. John thrashed the greens with a stick and carried the weight on his back to Springville to have it ground to flour. Also, while living in Palmyra, their first son George drowned at the age 11. In the spring of 1859, looking for better conditions, John and his brothers James and George and a few others, leaving their families behind, left for the upper Provo Valley, again now known as Heber. They needed to start their planting of new crops in this new valley. But while traveling up the canyon, they encountered a slide that the wagons were not able to go over. They camped at the base of the slide, and the next day they took apart their wagons, walked them across the slides, and reassembled the wagons, and then continued up the canyon. Later on in the early summer, John's food supply gave out, so he left Heber Valley and making the 37-mile trip down the canyon to return home to Palmyra and his family. The Provo River was running very high with a spring runoff, and about 7 to 10 miles down the canyon, while crossing the fast-running river, John, while struggling with his horse, fell off the horse and was kicked in the chest. Now John clung on to a bush in the river until help came and helped him out. As you can well imagine, it was a very hard time getting home. On July 24th, 1859, John moved his family of 5, the youngest being 5 months old, to Heber. Now it rained very hard while they were coming through the canyon, and it damaged their flour and their supplies. And after a couple of very miserable days, they arrived in Heber Valley with almost nothing. It appears they were able to live in the Heber fort, and that the land was divided amongst those first settlers in Heber. Now John did not recover from his injury in Provo Canyon, and in less than 2 months after bringing his family to their new home, on September 16, 1859, he died at the age of 34. John was the first white man to die and be buried in the Heber Cemetery. Elizabeth, his wife, was left with almost nothing and 5 small children to raise. Her husband's gone, her oldest son drowned at the age of 11, and 6 months after her husband's death, her baby Emma dies. How does one continue trial after trial? But Elizabeth does. She was an industrious, hard-working woman. She collected the leftover wheat from the farms, which is called gleaning. This is where they gather and collect the leftover crops from farmers' fields after they have been harvested. She picked hops and ground cherries and saved everything possible to support her family. Now the Carliles just could not get away from those grasshoppers, and in the years 1868 to 1869, another grasshopper plague invaded their crops. At this time, Elizabeth went to Echo Canyon to cook for a company of Heber men who were working on the railroad. In this way, she could provide food for her family during the hard times that followed. In 1872, Elizabeth worked at the Pinion Mine Company near Park City as a cook. Now at the time, Elizabeth was able to save enough money to send for her oldest daughter that had remained in England. Her daughter, Sarah Ann Eastwood, and her 3 children were then able to make the journey to Heber. Unfortunately, tragedy would fall again as Sarah Ann died the following year in 1873, leaving 3 young children in the care of Elizabeth. Elizabeth had an exceptionally hard life, but she never gave up. She died on January 22nd, 1893, at the age of 72. Now John, which I'm going to refer to as John the Younger, was born in Spanish Fork or Palmyra on October 25th, 1856. He was the 2nd son and the 6th child born out of 7 to John and Elizabeth Williamson. He was only a year old when his brother drowned, leaving him the only boy. He was almost 3 when his family moved to Heber, and a few months later when his father died. As a young boy now, the youngest, he was considered to be a lively boy full of fun and playing tricks, and some might say that he often got in trouble, but he was a real boy. As John grew older, he began to become more interested in the horse and cattle business. He owned many beautiful horses and especially liked the white ones. His horses always pulled 4 or 5 floats in the parade on the 4th and the 24th of July. His buggy horses were very lively but very well trained. He would not put up with sloppy horses. John married Sarah Elizabeth Crook on November 28, 1878. At first, they made their home in a little log house where 6 of their children were born. Now, before Charles Francis was born, they did move into the big stone house pictured here. 4 more children were then added to the family in this home. Emma, his daughter, remembers, quote, that treats were brought out after every evening meal. If any of us got into it before he wished to bring it out, we didn't get any when it was time to pass it around. He always stuck with the rules too, no matter how disappointed or how bad he felt, unquote. John was also known for giving very long prayers. And one day while the family was sitting around the table and John was giving one of his, lengthy prayers, when the family opened their eyes, one of their sons was standing on his head by the fireplace. I guess he got a little bored, and I'm sure the family got a good laugh out of it. Here's a picture of the Carlile family around 1895. Now John and Elizabeth had 2 babies die, and if you look in the right-hand corner, you see Charles Francis, and he looks to me to be around 5 years old. And remember that after this picture was taken, 2 more little girls came to the family. In 1895, at the age of 39, John was called to serve a mission. He left behind his wife and 5 small children. He served in the southern states, but after 6 months of serving, he became very ill and had to return home. John was very active in Heber City, serving as a constable for several years. He was a member of the town board several times. He directed the building of the Wasatch Creamery and helped organize the Northfield Irrigation Company. He was also director and watermaster for several years. He played in the brass band, and some say he played the violin at some of the dances. In June of 1902, at the funeral of his brother-in-law, John Carroll, John was carrying a casket as a pallbearer when the casket began to fall apart, and trying to keep the body from dropping on the ground as it was being carried from the house to the hearse, John was injured internally, and in just 2 weeks to the day, on June 21st, John Carlile dies as the result of his injury. He was just 46 years old. So now we end with the stories of our pioneer ancestors, the Carliles. Remember I started the video with me being in Temple Square and saying that we're going to tie the Carliles in with the monument of the seagulls? Now, even though our family did not experience the miracle of the seagulls as Salt Lake City Valley did, It still goes to show that they were greatly affected with this overwhelming plagues of insects, almost to the verge of starving to death. But as you can tell, our pioneer heritage persevered and overcame hardships that we cannot even imagine. So let's connect the whole family together so you understand your direct line that you come through. Our story ended with John the Younger, who is the father of Charles Francis. Now, Charles Francis was only 12 years old when his father passed away, and every kid had to step up so the family could survive. And more information on how they did that can be found in the Crook video. So again, to tie this all together, we end with showing John, his son Charles Francis, and the children of Charles Francis. And now you should be able to draw the line of which child you come from and your place in our family.
Okay, we're standing here in front of the John and Sarah Elizabeth Carlile home. This is the home that my grandpa, Grandpa Carlile, or Charles Francis, was born in. Now, I wanted to make sure that you understood that after John Carlile died, that the family was extremely poor, and it was all they could do in order to make ends meet. But Sarah Elizabeth made sure that her family was taken care of, and kudos to them. So this is the family home. Okay, here we are again in the Heber Cemetery. We're in the plot for the Carliles. So Grandpa's dad, John Carlile, and his mother, Sarah Elizabeth, are buried in this plot. So here's the headstone, and if you look down, you can see the plot of Sarah and John Carlile. And there you have it, the Carlile Connections. Okay, I'm standing in front of John Carlile. This is Robert Carlile's son, who was the first white man to die in the valley. So this is John Carlile, his headstone, and then you see the sheaf of wheat here, because that's what they were growing here, part of what they were growing in the valley. And then his wife, Elizabeth Carlile. And there you have it, the first white man to die in Heber Valley. Okay, we started with Robert Carlile because he's the pioneer that was converted to the church. And now we're going to end with Robert Carlile because he's the one that came into the valley. Robert was the 5th person to be buried in this cemetery. So honoring our ancestors and your Carlile connection, here's Robert and his wife Christiana.